Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. That sound that ushers you into today's Mind Your Banners is Mike Niziolek hammering away at his keyboard because there's an awful lot to write about, Mike. There's an awful lot to talk about, and we are going to dispense with all pleasantries, all ceremony. Mind Your Banners, December 18th, 2024. We're talking about the playoff, baby. Who thought we'd be talking about the college football playoff on December 18th? I mean, other than maybe Kurt Signetti. Yeah, I was going to say Kurt Signetti. Indiana, number 8 in the poll, number 10 in the seeding against Notre Dame, number 5 in the poll, number 7 in the seeding. Friday night was kickoffs 8 o'clock. God, I don't even know, 8 o'clock, right? I don't even know what time kickoff is because I just assume we're going to get there soon.
Yeah, I have no idea, to be honest. 8, maybe 9.
I just assume we're going to get there so early that it really doesn't matter. Like, just let me know when the ball's on a tee. The point is, the first game of the 12-team playoff is a renewal of an in-state series that has only been played once since 1960. In fact, I think technically since 1958. And it is, to me, Mike.
Why technically? Isn't it just since 1958? I mean, technically, there's no technically about it, right?
Yeah, I just did 60 just kind of like as a rounder number.
Round number.
I'll open the floor to you first because I'm fascinated by this game. I don't feel like I have a good grip on it at all. I think there's a lot of on paper strength on strength, but I think there's reasons why you would even sort of question some of the strengths that we're talking about on both sides and wonder, if that's quite going to show up the way that we think it is. So I guess let's start with this. Let's start with the highest sort of or the widest possible lens we can look through. What is the vibe check for you on this game here? Oh, just a little over 48 hours before kickoff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could spoil it. I mean, I picked Indiana in my prediction. I've sort of been spoiled.
Over.
I don't know if that was going to be kind of where you were going, but I just felt that I just think that this passing offense is going to do some damage. That I don't think Notre Dame has sort of an overwhelming talent advantage, roster-wise that like Ohio State did, or even Michigan's, I think, defense had in terms of, just raw talent. I don't think their front seven's the same as the ones that Indiana struggled with this year. And like you said, it's interesting as I was kind of going through the numbers, I kind of criticized Notre Dame's pass defense, but some of the same criticisms could be labeled towards IU's run defense that they, who have they faced? You faced, half of the bottom, 20, 25 teams in the country kind of on your schedule.
Yeah, we can get into this. Like, let's just dive in. Like, the strengths of these two teams seem to be, at least in terms of talking about this matchup, in their defenses. Because with Notre Dame, it's sort of like, well, Indiana couldn't really handle the physicality and the talent, and the depth of Michigan State and Michigan and Ohio State. From Indiana's perspective, it's Notre Dame hasn't seen a run defense anywhere near this good. They need to run the football to be successful. But if you're Indiana, you talk about both the teams they played, and also I would point out game state, so many of these games Indiana played this season, Indiana raced out to lead so quickly that teams just had to abandon the run, and so I don't feel like we ever got. Maybe Washington did, Ohio State did to a certain point, consistently got teams that were trying to really challenge Indiana to stop the run because they couldn't afford to. And then on the other side, as you pointed out, I think on this podcast and certainly in our conversations, sort of off air, Notre Dame's played a lot of teams that don't run the ball well, or don't pass the ball well, either by design, an Army, a Navy, a Georgia Tech, or, just frankly, because they're not very good, like a Florida State or a Purdue. So like there's, even these sort of statistical matchups feel a little bit skewed. And that's where I talk about, like, even the strength, sometimes I question looking at this game.
Yeah, but I think the difference, I guess, in my mind for Indiana is that the Ohio State was a good barometer. I mean, they allowed the 40-yard run sort of in the last minute or whatever. Would have held them under 100 yards if they had it. And I mean, still, it wasn't a bad effort with the 40-yard run. It was a 115-yard day for them. And, they've got probably two of the more talented backs that Indiana, in the Big Ten, to be honest. And so, I mean, you kind of look at that game and say, like, that kind of, maybe proves they're for real a little bit. If you didn't kind of believe in some of their, resume. I'm trying to pull up some of the stats for Notre Dame. I mean, the things that stand out for Notre Dame is that the games, they have played against sort of a real bona fide passing offense is the ones they've really struggled. It's the game against Louisville, or no, not Louisville. Where that's their passing off. No, it was Louisville. Louisville threw for 264 yards, 3 touchdowns. That was a 1-possession game. USC, that was a 49-35, but it was close pretty much throughout. They threw for 360 yards, 3 touchdowns. And I think the big difference in those games too is that those teams did turn the ball over, which Indiana really doesn't do. And so I think kind of the two keys, they get going offensively with the passing game and they don't turn it over. I feel like they have a real opportunity here to put their stamp on this game.
I also think like these two teams, to be fair, I think they also deserve credit. You bring up turnover margin. Like both these teams play pretty clean football. They're both pretty good in special teams. Notre Dame's been maybe a little bit more disruptive in that area. But Indiana, outside of the 2 gaffes against Ohio State, really has not hurt itself at all in special teams this season. They're 2 of the best teams in the country in turnover margin. Kurtis said something. I don't know how to fact check this. He said Notre Dame's forced 25 fumbles this season. Now, they didn't recover all 25, but he said 25, which is more than 2 a game. And I know that's exaggerated a little bit by the fact that I think Navy was kind of spitting the ball all over the place in that game. But the point is,
they've recovered 11. I mean, that'd be a lot to not recover.
Yeah, I mean that's the number used. These are 2 teams that and they aren't terribly heavily penalized. Like Notre Dame is kind of struggles with it. Indiana does not. Like these are 2 teams that in general really don't they don't get in their own way a lot. And obviously they do it differently offensively, but Notre Dame is very justifiably confident in what it's built around Riley Leonard, Jeremiah Love, who sounds like he's going to be healthy for this game, and Jadarian Price, and the way they run the ball. Indiana has, kind of built the opposite, obviously, around its pass offense. Somebody asked Kurt Signetti just this afternoon about the possibility of snow and the cold weather. And he kind of said, he made a joke kind of about Kurtis Rourke being from Canada. But then I think he justifiably pointed out Indiana had no problem passing the ball in the cold and snow against Purdue. It never really looked like, that was, and not like, okay, I get Purdue's not a very good team, but it's more the
elements
emphasis. The emphasis Rourke was able to place on his throws, his ability to sort of step up and deliver confidently, hit shots downfield, whatever. That didn't seem to bother him. These are also one of the many things that makes it hard for me to pull apart this matchup is these are 2 teams that don't hurt themselves a lot. And again, all of this is kind of colored by the fact that, and I know that it got magnified around here because listen, we cover Indiana. We're in the sort of IU bubble. It's always going to seem magnified when you're 10 feet from it rather than 10,000 feet from it. But a lot of the same strength of schedule concerns were kind of raised around Notre Dame too, in the playoffs, sort of in the rankings, and people asking Ward Manuel about things every week and whatever else. You can acknowledge that these 2 teams did not necessarily play the toughest schedules, but man, they don't make a ton of mistakes. They don't hurt each other. They don't hurt themselves very much.
Yeah, and I think it could come down to you mentioned kind of how the game goes. Like I think Indiana really knows how to play with a lead. Like if they can jump out early, get it, a 10-point, 14-point lead, and sort of play with that lead, they seem to really thrive in those situations. I mean, a lot of teams, I feel like, get conservative when they have a lead. Kind of go away from themselves, get a little. I don't know, sometimes anxious when they're actually up. But I mean, I think Mike Shanahan really called good games when they've had to lead, extended it, been able to kind of dominate time of possession, things like that. Maybe you take away some of their run game when you're up and they're trying to come from behind. I think that could dictate kind of how the flow of this game goes. I mean, you've seen, I think it was 9 times Indiana started with the ball. I think they scored on 8 of those or 7 of those. That's just off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure those numbers are close to right. So I mean, but you saw them just kind of generally when they started with the lead, they really never looked back. And I think Indiana would do well to get the ball first and go right down the field, because I think that would change the complexion of this game right out of the gate and maybe neutralize some of that crowd. Obviously, I think that's been talked a lot about in terms of how many Indiana fans will be able to get in. What they have 3,500 tickets, 3,000 tickets. Is there a allotment?
Yeah, it's 3,500 is the allotment. Secondary market prices have come down. They've
come down,
but like it's still the most expensive get-in game
by like 4 times. Yeah. So trying to neutralize that a little bit. Because we've heard him talk. Curt Cignetti, I think the crowd noise from Ohio State is keeping him up at night just based on how much he's talking about it. So I think that could kind of change the complexion of the game, because I think Indiana, just knows how to play with the lead really well.
You bring up crowd noise, and I want to talk more about the matchup, but I do kind of want to actually start with this, because I wrote something today. Like, Curt Cignetti has tried to frame so much of sort of the discussion around the Ohio State game procedurally. That what went wrong at Ohio State was, bad mechanics in the special teams, the silent snap count kind of getting found out. He said crowd noise affected us, but then he was kind of quick to say, and what I mean by that is we had to go to a silent count, and the silent count didn't work. He wasn't saying crowd noise affected us like we got a little rattled, like we just kind of maybe shrank from the moment somewhat. I do wonder, and I'd get in trouble if Curt Cignetti listened to this podcast. I suspect he won't. I do wonder if there's an extent to which maybe it did go a little deeper than that, a little bit more intangible than that, because Indiana does still kind of what? No, I mean, Indiana, to me, observing this team, does still seem like it's kind of feeling the scars of that game a little bit. And the thing is that can be a good thing. Like, that can go both ways. Somebody asked Marcus Freeman, if he still on, this was on Sunday, he had his news conference on Sunday. Somebody asked him if he still kind of felt like he carried, some of the scars or some of the fear of like Northern Illinois happening again. And he basically said yes. And a lot of coaches, I think, would say no. A lot of coaches would say that was a different team. That was 3 months ago. We've grown up. We've moved past it. It was obviously a learning experience, but, we're focused on Notre Dame today. He said, I'd be lying if I did not say that I still fear that kind of performance. And he said fear is a motivator. And I just wonder, like, it can be a good thing if Indiana is still carrying the Ohio State game around a little bit from a motivational perspective. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Part of me has suspected for a while now that maybe Indiana kind of claiming, that all of the ills and failings of Ohio State were just like, it's all just mechanics. It's all just like the machinery. And once we fix that, we'll be fine. I'm sure that's true to some extent, but I do think there's some intangible quality in there too. That's maybe Indiana's not going to say publicly, but might, for better or worse, we'll see, affect their performance in this game.
Well, I think that them carrying with it is true. I think it bothers them because this team. I think I was looking it up. I don't have the story pulled up, but the record of the guys that have been with Curt Cignetti since his first year at JMU is like 52-9. So, I mean, these are not players that are used to losing. The guys that have been with him the last like 2 years, that was only like their third loss. And some of them didn't even play in the bowl game last year. So it was only their second loss. So they don't like to lose, regardless of how it goes, like why. I think that they'll carry it with them just because they're angry about it and they're mad because it was like the chance to prove all the sort of doubters about their schedule and all that, sort of quiet that down. So I think that's why it sticks with them. I don't really agree with the, you think basically they got beat like physically, more so than sort of the mechanics of it all. Kurt Signet's talked about this multiple times. And in terms of some like the blitz pickups and all that, he charted it out and said that they really didn't have sort of a physical breakdown, that missed pickups. And obviously the mechanics of the silent snap count really played a factor in this. And he's talked about it so like over the top, like I'm never going to a silent snap count again. I think it really bothers him that he feels like he made a mistake. Like I think he wouldn't be so pronounced about it if he thought like, look, the team just got beat physically. I don't know.
I think no, sorry to cut across you, but I don't mean I think Indiana got beat physically, although there's an extent to which they did. I mean more that Indiana has kind of tried, it feels like, to cast that game as like the lessons we learned are all things that like you can spell out on a stat sheet or put on film or drill in practice, and that there's not like again, Notre Dame has not been shy about saying like, we carry the anger a little bit and the fear a little bit of another Northern Illinois that drives us. And to be fair, with respect to some of the teams Notre Dame was playing in the back half of its schedule, like they weren't necessarily as bad as Northern Illinois, but like if Notre Dame had lost to Florida State, it would have been viewed kind of similarly based on the season Florida State's having. I just think there's kind of an intangible motivation, however you want to describe it, whether it's, prove this wasn't us or, kind of the sting of the loss or whatever. I just think there's an extent to which, and maybe, I mean, like even there, when you talk about Signetti saying, your impression being that Signetti's kind of angry that he screwed up, even that, I think there's kind of an intangible element of that loss still sticking with Indiana in a way, again, that may well spur Indiana on. Like, I'm not suggesting it's necessarily a bad thing for Indiana. It's just been striking to me the extent to which Indiana has tried from basically the minute that game ended to cast the Ohio State loss as something that could be fixed schematically and not something that maybe needed to be like explored a little bit in the dark night of the soul.
I just don't think when you give up 14 points on special teams mistakes that you've not made all year, you could say the soul needs to be examined that deeply. Like if you don't have those two plays, like that game looks completely different. Like, I mean, I think there is a certain extent, like if you watch that game, you wouldn't come away with thinking like this team needs to re-examine their psyche from top to bottom or what they're doing. You'd be like, man, James Evan might want to take a bus home instead of taking the plane ride because that was rough, right? Like, I mean, and not to throw him under the bus, but like, I mean, those two mistakes, like you punch the wrong side of the field, they score a touchdown, and you drop the ball and they basically score a touchdown. I mean, look, that's impossible to overcome. So maybe this is too much on the Ohio State game. I just don't think their psyche is something to worry about. Like, I mean, I think that these guys, the core of this team has been with them so long that I just don't see that being an issue. As you're on your phone typing and texting, rude. We're on a podcast here, man.
I'm. You have no idea the sources I'm talking to right now. I'm not at all pulling up the Liverpool Southampton game, so I have it on one side.
Ordering buchettos.
It's getting your beloved potato pizza. Because that's totally what it's called. Let's talk about let's break down some matchups, I guess, like some individual sort of how does one side handle this for the other. The big one for me is the quarterbacks, and that's we kind of talked about it a little bit in broad strokes earlier on. I think there's a very good chance this is the best quarterback Notre Dame has seen all season in Kurtis Rourke. Indiana has not seen a quarterback that is as intentional about running the ball as Riley Leonard. You have two offenses that I think by this point in the season are very, very comfortable with what they do. They both, I mean, like this, I had Mike Berardino, our counterpart up in South Bend on our podcast yesterday, and he acknowledged, he said, listen, don't look at the names on the jerseys. Notre Dame wasn't necessarily always playing the toughest competition when they were putting up some of these big numbers in the the latter part of the season. You could say the same thing for Indiana. And the defense, justifiably in both cases, was, listen, all you can do is beat what's in front of you. And both of these teams just kind of laid waste to most of the teams they played over the course of their schedule. So you got two offenses that are very confident in what they do. And I think two teams, games like this, sometimes coaches can overthink them. They get a little bit too much extra time to break down film and game plan. I don't think either of these coaches is going to change very much who they are or what they do. I think this is going to be very much like, we're going to do what we're good at and make you stop it, rather than try to throw in some unexpected wrinkle. And so my point is, I think a lot of that starts with Indiana having to account for a truly mobile, physically difficult quarterback, and Notre Dame, having to account, I guess the weather could still affect it, but Notre Dame having to account for possibly the best passer it has seen all season in Kurtis Rourke.
Yeah, and maybe my sort of view of Riley Leonard is colored a little bit. I mean, the first time I saw him in person was in 2021. They played at Virginia Tech. That was just an absolute massacre. And Duke didn't show up, and he was 7-16 for 84 yards. Just looked really bad. Obviously, it's been a few years since then, but I mean, look, not a guy that I think is going to win you the game with his arm sort of in the final minutes. I think that, like I said, I think Virginia Tech, I think Indiana has a real edge here in terms of, a more dynamic passing quarterback. And I think it's going to make the difference. I just don't see Riley Leonard, especially if Indiana can get a lead in this game, bringing them back, through the air, with his arm.
I think, the other part of this is just, again, talking about maybe a team not changing who they are, what they do. Like Notre Dame has been willing, and Notre Dame's got some young corners. They got some really young guys at the boundaries, and they have not been afraid to empower those guys to play one-on-one coverage, man coverage. You kind of look at that and you think, is that something you're going to get away with in a game like this? If Kurtis Rourke is dialed in, if Indiana's protecting him, because Indiana's been so good in those single coverage situations. Obviously, on the other hand, Notre Dame has one of the best safeties in the country. So is Indiana going to try and, push deep shots at quite the level that maybe they would against some of the lesser teams that they played this season? That is, again, if we're talking about just like pieces of the matchup that fascinate me, it's provided that Indiana can run the ball just effectively enough to gain some balance and then protect Kurtis Rourke. Because, of course, it goes without saying, if Indiana runs into the same trouble with Riley Mills and Howard Cross that it had with Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, then, a lot of this stuff becomes more complicated. But if Indiana can kind of give Rourke the foundation, those corners have had some good moments, but they've also had some tough ones, not least that game against USC where, Southern Cal, as you mentioned earlier, put up some big numbers, although Notre Dame, I think, had 2 defensive touchdowns in that game. So it's not like Notre Dame didn't have its way a little bit there as well. Does Notre Dame do anything differently to try and protect those young DBs against an Indiana receiver core? And obviously I'm thinking in particular about Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper, that has really feasted when it's gotten one-on-one matchups against corners that were a little bit overmatched against its more experienced receivers.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're Notre Dame and you've watched kind of the Michigan and Ohio State game, you're probably bringing pressure. Probably blitzing because, Indiana had some problems with blitz pickups. Kurtis Rourke talked about that yesterday night. So I think you're bringing that pressure, especially early, to try to rattle them and to try to sort of make them think about it. I don't think you let them sit back there and try to get there with 4. I think you bring more, especially early, to try to set the tone and get them rattled, because I think you've seen it. That second half against Michigan, Michigan kind of teed off, and then those last 3 quarters when Kurtis just didn't even have time to even get out of the pocket, because I think you've seen him be mobile. He's not like just a guy that's just going to stand there and let people take shots, but he literally had no time to move. And so because of those blitzers, and so I think that that's probably what you do. But I think they've, Mike Bernardino was saying that they're a team that likes to blitz. So maybe that's not necessarily different, but I think you probably make it a priority just on what you've seen on film of them the last, two meaningful games they played, throughout the Purdue of it all. But I'd bring pressure. I mean, I think that's the clear sort of answer that, Indiana's got to prove that they can handle it.
And that's where I come back a little bit to areas of this matchup that are harder to define. So, like, areas that might become wild cards or X factors. I think Indiana's ground game might quietly be one. And what I mean by that is it like forgive me, I'm writing our chapters while I do this. I've tried to learn, like, I think people like it when we break up the podcast into chapters. And so I'm trying to do that more often.
All your notes are Zach makes another good point. That's all you're gonna write. That's all you write.
And I just make sure to get the time code too, so that people can just go right there. They don't need to listen to the whole podcast, just the parts of it that matter. But, like, Indiana has, Chris Ignetti said multiple times, like, we used to run the football a lot more. It's my offense. We don't as much as we used to. But Notre Dame's not as good stopping the run necessarily as it has been stopping the pass. And again, is that a factor of maybe playing more teams that just run the ball so much more that you're going to give up a few more yards, a few more plays, whatever? But on the other hand, we have spent, you and I both know that games like this can sometimes go this way, where you spend so much time in the buildup talking about, Kurtis Rourke and the receivers against young running backs. So you spend so much time talking about how Indiana's defense corrals a run game like it hasn't seen all season, or how the weather affects this or whatever. And then we get there and we find out it's something that we didn't see coming. Something a little ways down kind of the bullet points list that winds up having a really big impact on the game. And if you're asking me if there's something that could be that for Indiana, I do wonder if Indiana's ability, not necessarily to run the ball explosively, but if Indiana can, against a defense that is very good, very talented, but has at times not necessarily been as dominant against the run as like Ohio State has, as Michigan has, if Indiana can open some holes and can put that pass rush back on its heels a little bit, that makes a huge difference to me. And the other piece of this is, and I want to talk about this a little bit in a minute, you mentioned, how important it might be for Indiana to, kind of get this game to a place where Indiana's making Notre Dame chase the game a little bit on the scoreboard. The more you can control the ball while you're scoring, the easier that is. Don't get me wrong, points are the ultimate currency. Like, if I offer you one play 75-yard touchdown drives, you're going to take them every time. But if you're making Notre Dame chase on the scoreboard and you're burning clock and you're offering some of these drives that we've seen Indiana put together this season, 9, 10 plays, 12 plays, 5.5 minutes. So you're shortening the game while scoring on Notre Dame. I just wonder if that ground game might be a bit of an X factor for Indiana that we're not talking about enough in a game like this.
Well, I might frame it differently. Like, if they struggle as much as they did against Michigan and Ohio State, they could be in trouble, because those games, they're the two worst games of the year. 28 carries, 40 yards against Michigan, 41 carries for 83 yards against Ohio State. Some of that was the sack yardage. They're undefeated when they've crossed the 200-yard mark this season, I think 5-0. If they can't get anything, if they can't get at least 3 to 4 yards a carry, they average less than 2 yards a carry in those two games that I was referring to, I think it could be a problem. Like, they need to be some, like you said, it's not busting out a number like 20-yard runs. Even though maybe a couple of 10-yarders would help, just kind of open things up. I just think it needs to be a functional run game, which they just didn't have in those two games against Michigan and Ohio State. Ohio State really hurt them because obviously, the passing game ended up being just a mess. They just need to be moderately successful, like the Maryland game, right? 42 carries, 151 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3.6 yards per carry. Not numbers that jump off the page, but they were effective enough in that game, especially in the second half, where they did what you said, contributed to helping him run out some clock, got some key first downs. You're not asking them to take over the game. I just think you need them to be more impactful than they were sort of in those losses.
And a big part of finishing drives. That's another
Yeah.
piece of this. Indiana's been one of the best red zone offenses in the country. I know we talked.
I wrote about that, and it's 20 of their 22 touchdowns have come in the red zone, the running backs.
Yeah.
So you kind of see, just really effective in the red zone area.
Yeah, and it sounds simplistic, but how many times do you see a team, lose a game that's relatively close, and you can point back to, maybe like a couple touchdowns that turned into field goals, or a time when you had a chance to convert a big third down to get into a better scoring situation and you couldn't do it. And it's worth kind of bringing up here too that Howard Cross is back. I mentioned him earlier. Riley Mills is Notre Dame's sack leader, 6'5", 295. Howard Cross is kind of his running mate at defensive tackle. Was really good last season. I think it was a little bit surprising he didn't go to the NFL. Came back this year. He's had a bunch of injuries. I think he had a hamstring problem earlier in the year. I think it's a high ankle sprain that's had him out the last 5 or 6 weeks. But he is back, and by all accounts from Marcus Freeman, he is back and healthy for this game. So, you're going to get Notre Dame's best shot defensively. And it just feels, like I said, like I for all that we are talking about what this game might come down to, kind of the headline performers, the headline stars, the players that are kind of first name on the team sheet, so to speak, offensively on both sides.
Did you just call them starters?
Yeah, but not even. I mean, like the first guy penciled in. It's not just the starter. It's like no question. It's the first
star
guy.
Player. You're like a lot of words for just saying they're stars. They're
first name on the team sheet is a soccer term, and I do have
first name on the term sheet, like
team sheet, not term sheet, team sheet.
But they could be on the term sheet too, I would imagine. First on the term sheet.
Well, I think that's the idea, hopefully, for a lot of them, is that they're finding a term sheet at some point, but not before this game. I mean, again, it's kind of open-ended, but what you've had a couple weeks to digest this matchup. I feel like I've steered a lot of this conversation. What has maybe caught your eye most about Notre Dame? And I know you said you picked Indiana, but I think you and I both expect probably a close game either way. What has jumped off the page to you most about maybe what got this Notre Dame team here, and what is, what maybe if I was to tell you Notre Dame wins on Friday night, what are the 2 or 3 things?
What are the 1, 2, 3, or 4 things that happen? Well, I think like I said, I think they turn it over. I don't think you're losing this game with no turnovers for Indiana. I think you're turning it over 2 to 3 times, which they haven't done. One thing I looked up too, was when I was doing that red zone story. Kurtis Rourke's not thrown a red zone interception this year. This is a team that just really doesn't shoot itself in the foot a lot, outside those 2 special teams mistakes we've talked about. I think if they lose, there's going to be some sort of self-inflicted wound here that they because I think the talent matchup to me on paper is not as, like I said, wide of a gap as you saw. I thought that Michigan defense was full of NFL players or NFL caliber players, and I don't know that from top to bottom. Or missing Will Johnson in that game. I think from top to bottom, that's a more intimidating defense than the one Indiana's going to face this weekend. And quarterback wise, I'm not blown away by Riley Leonard. He can run, and I think that maybe look, Indiana's expressed some confidence about what stopping the quarterback runs, that they've it's really sort of a matter of not getting out physical, sort of just technique and fundamentals, and really not scheme. Are they being a little overconfident in that way? I guess maybe that's the X factor to me. I'm just assuming that they won't fall apart when they see something they haven't seen really with these quarterback runs, because they've been such a physical front. Their front seven has been really good this year, and I think it's even been better. We talked about Aiden Fisher talked about Reliant Hardy. They've been going to the 4-3 more. All those looks against the run have worked for them. And so I guess if they don't win, or, get beat by double digits or something, I think that will have to have failures in that part of the game. That they'll sort of stated their belief that they can just, lean on their identity to beat the run game, the quarterback runs specifically.
Uberazzi asked where the officiating crew's coming from. I honestly don't know. My assumption would be neither the ACC nor the Big Ten. Typically it's a pretty tried and true sort of maxim that you make every effort to make sure that there's no sort of evidence of bias between the two opponents. But I just did a quick Google while you were kind of finishing up your answer there, and I could not find anything specific. I want to circle back to Riley Leonard because the one last thing that I think is interesting about this game, not the one last thing, but one of the last things I want to talk about this game, because you mentioned Aiden Fisher too. I feel like this is a challenge for Indiana's linebackers that they haven't gotten a lot of this year, in the sense that like Indiana's been so good controlling the line of scrimmage with 4, with maybe 5, that its linebackers have kind of just been allowed to play free, get aggressive, get downhill, just kind of go hunt the ball. This is probably a game where you have to be a little bit more disciplined in terms of like where you're going, post snap. I know Brian Haynes says the post snap kind of reads don't change a ton, but I find it hard to believe that's completely true when you're facing a true quarterback. You love him saying,
wow. You should have questioned him when he was giving the answer at the press conference. You're like, Brian, I'm gonna have to agree to I'm gonna have to cut you off here. I'm gonna have to agree to disagree with that. Like that's what you should say at the moment, not in the podcast.
My point is, this is to me a challenge for Indiana's linebackers who have been so good and so integral to this team's success. We've seen Aiden Fisher on All-America lists. We've seen Jalen Walker, I think was either third team or honorable mention All Big Ten. Isaiah Jones, Bones Jones to his friends. You mentioned Elijah Hardy. Even the backups have gotten demonstrably better as the season's gone on. This just feels like a challenge they haven't seen before. And I'm just kind of fascinated to find out, does that change anything about what Indiana is defensively when maybe its linebackers, have to dial back that aggression just that little bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I do think that it'll be interesting to see what kind of split they do. Do they go with Terry Jones and kind of the 5 safety? Is that how they sort of play the run game with the quarterback? Or do they do, you mentioned Hardy has sort of taken a little bit more of the snaps from Jones when they've gone to more of this 4-3 look at as for an extended period of time. Do they rely on that with the 3 linebackers against the quarterback runs? I'm sort of interested to see what the approach is. I think you like, if you're talking about Walker and Hardy are really, really athletic. And I think that both of them, having them on the field at the same time, sort of on each edge, really will help them cover a lot of ground, help them make up for some mistakes. If somebody's not reading a key right. And so I'm sort of interested to see if that's the way they go. And if the athleticism of those guys, Hardy's a little younger, so you kind of maybe worry about mistakes. But, Walker, I know Aiden Fisher's got maybe the more national attention in terms of awards. Walker's the freak, right? The athletic freak that you want in a game like this, that you want chasing down a quarterback, or you want sort of dictating.
And also, I know I opened this question with talking about Riley Leonard, but the other part of this is Notre Dame's backs are both explosive. They both average more than 7 yards a carry. A lot of times, if you're dealing with explosive running backs, if they get upfield, you've already lost the battle. But if you stretch them out laterally, and you talk about, certainly Jalen Walker, but even the way that Indiana involves Terry Jones, the way Indiana kind of involves its safeties in its run packages defensively, that just frankly stretching plays out and not giving Notre Dame backs easy lanes to turn up into kind of at the beginning of developing run plays. I think that's an important piece of this as well.
Did you throw up this comment? Will IU have a designated spy? That's funny. Walker, that was one of those things I put on my interesting things that happened yesterday. Walker let slip that they had designed some new plays or installed some new plays, and one of them was having a spy on Leonard. And I sort of jokingly wrote that, not going to get in the doghouse for that because they don't like revealing information, coaches. I mean, we were at practice yesterday and they stretched for 10 of the 15 minutes we were there. So obviously trying to keep all that under wraps. But Jalen Walker did say one of the things they will do, or, who knows, maybe it was a strategic reveal to sort of give them thinking about it.
Double bluff.
Right, double bluff. You never know. I mean, I wouldn't put it past Cignetti's playing 4D chess here. But he talked about installing some of that stuff. And that's like what I'm saying, and sort of structure what this all looks like, because they really haven't had to worry about this all year. So how do they approach it? Because we haven't really seen that from Brian Haynes, having to sort of scheme up a look against a running quarterback.
Last thing I want to talk about is the coaching matchup, and we'll kind of round to a close here. I technically have a hard out at 3:30. I think these are both really good coaches. Obviously, they are coaches coming at this game from different points in their careers. Marcus Freeman, I think, has really grown into that job at Notre Dame. Curt Cignetti, I think it's interesting, and I have since basically we figured out Indiana might be a playoff team. He's going to have more actual literal playoff experience than just about anybody else in this field, in the sense that he's had to navigate the FCS playoffs and the idea of a slightly tighter turnaround from the end of the regular season to the postseason, and how you kind of get things locked in and how you manage a roster when it's not like bowl prep where there's a bunch of time off. And I think the last piece that I'm curious about is essentially, if this comes down to a moment, like just one little, I don't think some massive wrinkle, but some little chess move, some little tweak, like when, for example, Indiana spots the slow mechanics of the Michigan State punt team and goes for a block in that game. Who do you think has the advantage? And I'll let you lead into that because we do need to wrap up here. Do you want to give us your prediction? You kind of spoiled it earlier.
I already spoiled it, so I ruined it. Nobody has to listen to the episode. They got it at the front. I think you obviously favor Cignetti just because of the length and body of his work. He's shown to be, I think, a fantastic game manager. Outside of the silent count, which I don't know how you avoid it if you can't hear the things and you haven't sort of practiced some alternative. He hasn't made many mistakes this season. He touts his own record in one-score games. He's very fond of bringing that up. But I think it speaks to the fact that, look, he's been there. He coached under Nick Saban. He's sort of, he's talked about, making his mistakes during that time. But I think what he learned was just sort of the overall structure, lets his coaches coach. We've joked about him standing so far away from the team, kind of on the sideline, but I think it's to sort of have a view of the game. You never worry about, like, you've seen all these kind of clock disasters in the last 2 minutes in the last couple of weeks, just like all these teams screwing up, and you don't expect that from him. So I think you'd take Cignetti. My prediction was 34-24 Indiana. Like I said, I think they get up early. If they don't turn the ball over, I think it's a double-digit win.
I would take Cignetti too. I picked Notre Dame 27-20, but like if you told me the result was flipped, I would have no trouble believing that. In fact, there are, barring like extreme outliers like 50-10, there are very few results that you would have a hard time selling me on. Like I think this is a fascinating matchup. I think when you look at all of the different sort of, individual battles that are going to go on in this game, all of the sort of, like, you've got, I think, two really good sets of coordinators. I think you've got two programs that are very confident in what they do. And I think you've got a situation where nobody's going to overthink this, where both sides are just going to come in and say, we do what we do, and we're going to make you stop it. And I would be surprised if this is a blowout in either direction. I think it's going to be a really good game, and it's going to be, I suspect, a lot of fun to cover. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. I doubt we'll talk to you again before kickoff on Friday night. But thank you all so much. Thank you, everyone, as always, who joined us on the stream. Thank you to everyone who listened on all your various podcast platforms. For the Indianapolis Star, the Bloomington Herald Times, this has been Mind Your Banners, previewing, if you believe it, Indiana in the college football playoff. We will talk to you Friday night.